Welcome to Turning the Tide. This is Candace Salima coming at you from the heart of the Rocky Mountains. And today we are going to be interviewing Dr. Nancy Kobrin. She is the author of The Banality of Suicide Terrorism, The Naked Truth About the Psychology of Islamic Suicide Bombing. Now, as my listeners know, I am quite versed on Islam and everything that is going on over there, but this is a new take, and she's got some stunning reviews out there about it, and so much so that Army PsyOps is using this to help them understand what they are facing every day over there in the Middle East. So Nancy, Dr. Kobrin, welcome to Turning the Tide.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you. Now, just for my listeners, realize that Dr. Kobrin is actually in Tel Aviv, Israel, and so we are conducting the interview across the world. So if we run into some sound issues, that's all that's going on. So stick with us, and we will get this done. Now, Nancy, before we go into the actual book, I think there are three phrases I would like you to define, because I think I was halfway through the book before I sat down and said, okay, I've got to define these three things so that I am reading this from the right perspective. And so let's define political domestic terrorism. I mean, is that what you called it? Yeah, political domestic violence,
yes.
Domestic violence, and then early mother. Those are the three things that, let's do a quick definition for the listeners of Turning the Tide so they have a good foundation before we go into this, okay?
That sounds great. Well, let me first start with domestic violence, because I think most of us are more aware of it. And as you know, the Center for Disease Control in the United States says that 1 out of 4 women experience some form of domestic violence, some form of abuse, even to the most extreme murder. And in domestic violence, we often see murder-suicide together. So this is a concept that is important to keep in mind, and also an image, because this is a moment where the, say, the abusive partner murders his wife or partner, and then commits suicide, so that 2 people are fused in death. Now, what I did is I coined a new concept, and that is political domestic violence. Why did I do this? First off, because in terrorism studies and among counter-terrorists, they tend to talk about violence as political violence. It's a category that they've kind of set up, and they would separate that out from other kinds of violence. But of course, these are constructs that we human beings make, and I was more interested in looking at the imagery and the commonality and how these different forms of violence interrelate. And as we know, aggression breeds aggression, and violence can act like a contagion. So I'm kind of saying we have domestic violence, and then we have political violence of terrorist attacks, and I'm looking at commonalities and links and how they can influence each other and why this is so terribly important. Now, the third concept that you're asking about is the early mother. And this is very important. And the early mother I would define as the woman carrying a baby, being pregnant in utero up to, say, age 3, because we know that the prenatal mother and the postpartum mother, that this is the time where the brain of the baby is really developed and made, and the emotional attachment to the baby is extremely important. And this is a very interesting time frame, because it's the time where a baby and a child may not have, they don't really have memory that they can speak of at this time because they're developing their language skills, but they have body memory.
Okay, Dr. Kobrin, let me ask you this. As I was reading your book, this is what finally clicked in my head with this concept of the early mother and the children, developing their brains, their speaking skills, their social skills. They internalize the sense of right or wrong from their parents, and then that is reinforced or by the behavior or the relationship between the parent and the child. Now, I'm very familiar with attachment disorder. And as I was reading your book, that seemed to me, attachment disorder seemed to play a part of the direction you were going with the family unit in the Arabic culture. Did I get a good frame of reference there, or was that bad and wrong?
You are right on the mark. It's all about bonding with the early mother, and you can call that maternal attachment, and that this bonding experience is our first bonding experience in life.
And the most critical, right?
And the most critical, and it is from that bonding that we then enter into other kinds of relationships and other kinds of bonding. And this takes us back to domestic violence. There's been a lot of work in domestic violence, and basically one of the terms that they refer to is traumatic bonding. And this is where between a husband and a wife or a partner that the bonding is so intense, but it is bonding through violence. And there's a lack of poor social skills in being able to disengage and to talk about one's problems, to have insight and reflection onto their problem, and there is a kind of cognitive deficit in these kinds of relationships. So so this is part of the terrain that I'm looking at, and what struck me, and I really have to be honest that this is something I've had a long-standing interest also in Islam. I started studying Arabic in like 1979 and did a lot of work in theology, in Old Spanish and Arabic script, and so I had sort of the historical frame of reference and also exposure to the culture, and also have quite a bit of Hebrew. So this kind of background, I started, though, looking at the crime scene of the suicide attack. So to back up for a second, I first studied the theology and Islam, and then I became a psychoanalyst and focused on trauma. So I kind of evolved. I went from looking at communities to individual identity and then sort of back. And I started thinking about the crime scene of the suicide attack as what was it really? And I started looking through the literature and looking particularly at the imagery, and I was struck by the fact that you have murder-suicide in the crime scene of a suicide attack. And if you recall, there was a whole big discussion, should we call it homicide bombing and suicide bombing, etc. And yet it seemed to me to be so obvious that it's murder-suicide, and where else do you find murder-suicide in domestic violence?
Right. Okay. Now, Dr. Kobrin, let me ask this then.
Sure.
The Banality of Suicide Terrorism, the book itself, and this is what I really, really believe Americans, or actually the entire Western world, needs to understand when they read this book. Dr. Kobrin is coming at it from the Arabic family dynamic, the Arabic Islamic family dynamic. And Dr. Kobrin, I'm going to say right off the bat, as an American, as a Western American, I really struggled to to get that light bulb turned on in my head as I was reading your book until I made that attachment disorder connection. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing opened up and I understood exactly what you were saying. And so that's why part of the reason I wanted to interview you for the entire show today instead of just half the show is because I think this is such a critical thing that we need to understand as Westerners through the entire Western world, what we are dealing with the psychology of Al-Qaeda, of the terrorists, of suicide bomber terrorists, of the entire thing, and how it begins at birth, and how it is generational in the Arabic culture. This is not something that we can excise in one generation because it goes back millennia, right?
Yes, I would say that the critical problem is the devalued female in Arab Muslim culture, and that the little girl is so devalued early on for such a long time and so chronically that this whole area is not well understood as to the ramifications. And by the time she becomes a mother at probably all too young an age, she's already pretty compromised and pretty much running on empty. And this is
I would go as far to say, Dr. Kobrin, that she is completely damaged beyond repair.
I can understand you saying that, and I always kind of want to leave the window or the door open for hope and for possibility of even being in so compromised a position that she would be able to promote change in herself. But surely it's a very, very, very difficult position. And when she becomes a mother, in Arab Muslim culture, the mother is over-idealized and the female is devalued. And it says...
Okay, explain that, because that seems to be contradictory in definition.
It does sound to be very paradoxical. It's as if the mother is in a category all to herself. It's almost as if she's not female. And terrorists have trouble. They devalue females so much, and you just have to think of the position of females in Sharia law and, say, for example, in Saudi Arabia or many other, Pakistan as well, that the terrorists have trouble understanding that they could be born from such a devalued female body. So they are.
If we go with the attachment disorder and understand that infants internalize their parents' sense of right and wrong, and then what that infant is internalizing from the Arabic Islamic mother is what? It's
the female baby is internalizing male hatred of the female as self-hatred. So it's a severe problem in self-esteem, in feeling good and confident, and in being able to relate and to be able to relate to the baby in a more healthy way. And I'm a little reluctant to speak pervasively in that way, because there are always exceptions. Yes. But still in all, it's a very, very difficult situation to be in, and it's very delicate to talk about it, because I'm not wanting to blame the mother or the female, but rather because that's the last thing we need to do, but rather to understand how compromised they are and how much a catch-22 the situation is. It's almost like in Arab Muslim culture, the mother, the little girl or the girl or woman receives honor when she has her first male son. So up until then, she doesn't have sort of any cultural self-worth. And that will then have the mother live her life through her son, which is not necessarily such a healthy thing, because it's the misuse of the adult, the son, who then gets tied into his mother. And in ways we can understand, there are parallels to this in Western culture, because we have pockets of patriarchal culture where there are difficulties and where it can spread. And we also have to account for the fact of why there are so many converts to Islam as well, and then to radicalization. But the basic problem is the devalued female, and that the male does not feel competent and confident also, because they resort to bonding through violence. So it's self-perpetuating.
Yeah, and the problem, it is so pervasive in every level. The child cannot internalize a healthy, solid, strong understanding of right or wrong, of sexual identity, and what I mean by that is male, female, not other kind, and understand.
Candace? Candace?
See?
Yes.
That was bizarre. I don't know what happened. So did you hear my question?
Please repeat it, because there was the disrupt. It's probably because it's I'm on the other side of the world, so to speak.
Okay.
And there's been a big rainstorm here in Tel Aviv also, so I don't know if it's weather related.
Okay, all right. Let me rephrase the question then. What I was asking was the dynamic in the Arabic Islamic culture and family is so damaged in so many ways that the infant cannot internalize a solid, good sense of right or wrong. They can't internalize good connections, bondings, and relationships because of the dynamic of that family. In the book, and I checked out your website, familysecuritymatters.org, that you sent me, and so I can't remember if it was on that website or in your book, where you talked about there are almost 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide, and 1% of those are expected, are about terrorists, about that amount.
Yes.
That gives us about 15 million approximately. Now, with this extremely damaged mother because of the idealization of the mother role, but the devaluation of the woman as a whole, what makes almost 1.5 billion Muslims okay, figuratively speaking, okay, and 15 million of them become terrorists? What is the thing that breaks them out like that?
Well, it's a really difficult question that you're at. Very, very, first of all, it's the key question, and we're still working very much with a Model T Ford. However, I think farther down the road we'll be able to hone in on the multifactorial confluence of issues that come together that trip the wire, that makes somebody become radicalized. But let me back up, because you hit the nail on the head again about the problematic nature of the family. And in this kind of a family setting, there are no boundaries. So a child cannot feel safe. And of course, the mother doesn't feel safe either. Even though she may have a male child, she is still very much at risk of having to endure all sorts of harassment, if not violence outright. And in many of the case studies of the terrorists, there's something always problematic very early in their childhood that is mentioned in bypassing, or, for example, the child witnessed a violent relationship and the father beating the mother up and this kind of thing. And that is going to compound and complicate his life history and how he learns how to deal with other people. You know, violence becomes then the benchmark for engaging with other people. And it's like the culture is saturated in violent behavior. For example, and we have to, there's one other thing that I haven't mentioned so far, which is very, very important in Arab Muslim culture, and it is a shame-honor culture. And shame...
Explain that. Yeah, that's critical. You're right.
Yeah, first off, it's different from Christian culture, basically, or Jewish culture, because there's not a sense of guilt. When you feel guilty, you have the capacity to make reparation. And this is not necessarily the case because it's shame honor. It means that the group sense of self is more important than the individual. And when the group sense is insulted or shamed, it has to seek revenge. And the way you cleanse honor is you cleanse it by spilling blood. So it's sort of like there's a mistranslation, a cultural mistranslation along the way that these kids learn that cleansing really should be done with soap and water, not with blood. And so there is this kind of valuation of violence that's different from in the West. But that's not to say that we can't relate to it, because we know that there are pockets of shame honor culture in the West as well.
Yeah.
And we do, and my point about going back to one of the things why it kept on going back to the early mother is I began to understand the suicide attack site as a crime scene, a kind of hybrid of three things: murder, suicide, body parts. We heard all the time about body parts, and I was the first person to ask the question, what is the psychological meaning of the body parts, and where else do you find them? And you find body parts in serial killing, and the serial killer dismantles the body because it's a rage that exceeds murder itself, and the rage is against the early mother. And we know in psychology that body parts are a concrete representation of the mother's body, what we call part object. And it goes back to this early time frame of the baby, toddler. When a baby's first born, the baby does not know the mother as a separate individual. The baby knows the mother from a sense of touch, smell, lips, eyes, skin. Sound, exactly. And slowly comes to integrate a picture as mother being separate from him or her. But you can grow up into an adult like Ted Bundy and still have a lot of part objects rattling around in your head, and you can look normal on the outside but be quite disturbed on the inside and have had quite a chaotic childhood.
Now, I heard it once described, speaking of a serial killer's mind, as if a mirror inside the mirror of a soul was fractured, and it shattered and showing all these different pieces and bouncing off each other, and it's fractured in such a way that it's got a whole bunch of dimensions and so on and so forth, and that's what the inside of a serial killer looks like. It's so broken that
right.
that the inside never matches the outside.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. And in what I like to stress with suicide bombing, that it's serial killing by proxy, because the suicide bomber is the weakest link in the terrorist organization.
Explain
that. And that means that those who are more significant are the leader, the charismatic leader, the bomb maker, the engineer. That's why you have a lot of highly educated men and some women involved in terrorist organizations who are, have Ph.D.s and are building bombs, but they're the serial killers. They're the ones who make the bombs, and then you have the sender or the handler that will take the suicide bomber to his attack site or groom them, so to speak. But the charismatic leader is never going to send his own children to become suicide bombers, generally.
Because the suicide bomber, to the masterminds of it, is nothing more than the instrument through which they deliver that mass murder. It's not a human being, not a man, not a woman, not a girl, not a boy.
Right.
The suicide bomber is nothing more than another instrument that they have developed and created.
Exactly. And there was one other thing that I was going to say in connection to this, and it sort of skipped my mind, but
it'll come back. I apologize.
Yeah, the senders, it's quite brutal that they would send one of their own. So that brings me to the next point, which is that it's also kind of a form of honor killing, because that is how you redeem your honor. And you know that in Arab Muslim culture, if there's an innuendo, a woman is murdered, but they call it honor killing. And in a way, they're sending one of their own, so it's very revealing behavior. And it's a way of redeeming their own honor. They call them shaheed, but it's also, more importantly, it purges the group of its mounting aggression and rage, because these are not relaxed, friendly, these are people filled with hatred. And so
the only way they can appease the group is by the wholesale murder of people, and the more the better. Did I understand that properly?
Yes, that it's ongoing violent behavior. Yes, I would say that.
Why? And this is something
and it's
that.
Pardon, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is something the Western American mind cannot grasp. How does your life go from being normal and healthy to so enraged that only the murder of as many people as possible can appease that heart? How does that happen?
I think for them it's so culturally sort of ingrained that there aren't better tools, because something is not getting developed on the motherboard of the baby's brain.
And
this something is empathy. And from what I've been told in neuroscience, they're beginning to find a lack of mirror neurons, which are important for the development of empathy. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have been told that my descriptive analysis is beginning to show support in certain research. But
really?
It goes back to the fact that there are no boundaries, that the individual is not valued like in the West. So the the importance of moving forward and separating in a healthy way from one's parents and becoming more mature and all that sort of escapes the cultural milieu in Arab Muslim culture. Of course, some of that is, we have to hope and be realistic at the same time, but probably with the improvement of the status of the female over, it's going to take, in my opinion, generations, it will get better, but we have to be aware of this. And also it's important to understand a couple more things. One is...
Okay, Nancy, hang on just a second.
Sure.
We need to take a break, and then when we come back from the break, let's pick up right there with a couple things, okay? All right. Thank you. We'll be right back on Turning the Tide.